Welcome to the Berkshires Gone By, history and folklore about the westernmost and most beautiful county in Massachusetts. I'm your host, Brooke. During the Civil War, scores of Berkshire men left to go fight for the Union. Everyday men, unaccustomed to battle, coopers, potters, millers, they all went away to war, leaving their loved ones behind. William Saunders was a farmer, and just one of the many who'd leave. In 1861, he hugged his wife, Belle or Emma, stories differ, and his children farewell before leaving, with other North Adams men on their way to join up. The horrors of battle were countless, the utter brutality and the waste of life. His wife, sheltered from the chaos but aware of the dangers, waited uneasily at home. Letters from her husband would come and ease her worry for a moment, before she'd remember that these letters, of course, were days, sometimes weeks old. About a year after he'd gone, a different sort of letter arrived. The penmanship, obviously not that of William. Its contents caused the breath to catch in her throat. William had been wounded, quite badly. She carefully folded the letter and tucked it away. Odd that a simple sheet of paper could have such power. Days to weeks to months became 2 long years, but she'd kept it together. She had to. Her kids needed her, and she had to make a living now, had to keep up the farm. But more word from the army of William never came. Without the help of her husband, she was forced to spend some of what little they made hiring farmhands. As time passed, she began to accept that William was never coming back, that he'd died, and had been laid to rest in a hasty grave beside a battlefield with countless others, all fated to never return home. As the months went on, she and one of her farmhands grew closer. He was a good, kind man, good to her, good to her children. So they married. She'd never forget William. She'd be sure her children never did either. But she needed this. She needed happiness again. And that's just what William saw when he stood awestruck on the country road out in front of his home. In 1863, he'd been released with the coming of the end of the war, finally well enough to head back to North Adams. The long walk took forever, but it was thoughts of his family that kept him moving, even through the pain of his war wounds. All he'd longed for stood before him: the familiar mountains, the great trees along the rolling country lane, the fields of his own farm, the home he bought for them, and her, lovely, beautiful her, his wife, stood in the strong arms of another man. William didn't at first understand, and found himself backing away from the scene, in which he'd so far remained unnoticed. His retreat took him just into the tree line on the opposite side of the road, and from the sheltering darkness of the lush forest, he gazed, disbelieving. As the flutter of his heart slowed, William became painfully aware of what must have happened. He knew the army had written home for him when he was so horribly wounded. After that, he'd been too incapacitated to write her himself. His mind had been so muddled, he'd sometimes even forgot where home was. All of this, was his own doing. He'd not told her he was still alive, and how could he blame her for thinking that he must be dead, when so many other men she'd known were? It'd been years, so his widow had moved on. If he were really dead, she'd need help with the farm. She'd need help with the children. She'd need love. He would be happy for her, were he really dead. He leaned heavily on a nearby tree. It was utterly amazing how one's entire world could shift so quickly. It wouldn't be just she who thought him dead. It would be everyone, the entire town, all his family. And what would become of his happy widow if he were to walk out of the protective forest's shadows and announce his return? She and her new husband would suddenly be adulterers, and she a polygamist, both against the law. He didn't dare turn the woman he loved into a criminal. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't her fault, or even that of the man who now held her. He couldn't find it in himself to hate that man, only envy him. No, William would not reveal himself. Not ever. He straightened, took one last look, and turned, walking quietly deeper into the woods. Its great carpet of lush green extended for miles and over many mountains. Only here and there, punctured or torn by a farm or a country dirt road. It was upon the tallest of these mountains, in the deep of this forest, that William Saunders set up a home of sorts. It was really little more than a shack, situated in a place upon Mount Greylock, called Bellows Pipe. There he lived mostly off the land, but was forced into town on occasion to replace things that he was unable to make. His clothes worn, hair long, beard grown full, and skin tanned, he hardly resembled his old self at all. This made his movements around town easier, as even his oldest friends were unable to recognize him. He picked up work here and there to earn a little money. The townsfolk grew used to seeing him, and noticed that he'd come down from Greylock during harvest season, when he'd help farmers for a little pay. Because of his reluctance to give them his real name, he was gifted the nickname Old Coot by the townspeople. Years passed that way, decades. He watched his children grow from a distance, watched them marry and start lives of their own. He watched his widow and her other husband grow older too, more confident in each other, more comfortable, and still, no one suspected. It was a dark winter day. The sky looked heavy and ominous, warning of a coming storm. William, in preparation, tucked himself up in his mountainside shack, a fresh stack of firewood, blankets at the ready, but he worried that he was thinner than usual. It had already been a difficult winter, but there was little more he could do. But wait. The snowfall did come, and buried the village below. The fields and the narrow valleys, and the mountains alike. The bitter cold that came with it sent those in even the most cozy homes to huddle under blankets close to their firesides. Most people spent the next day trying to dig out, digging paths to nearby barns so that they could feed their livestock. People were so busy with putting their own lives back in order that no one noticed that the old Coot hadn't been around for a few days. After some time, a group of curious young men, who thought they knew about where the old Coot's cabin could be, headed up the mountain to find it. When they did, they were startled to discover no smoke rising from its little chimney, and when the bravest among them pushed open the door, William Saunders was found inside, dead. His body lay, wrapped tightly, in just about every piece of fabric in the shack, and beside the ashes of a dead fire. But it hadn't been enough to keep out the cold. The young men crowded into the room, wondering how to get William's body back down the mountain, when a strange shudder jolted the cabin. One young man had just chalked it off to the weight of the heavy snow settling on the roof, when a bright shadow leapt up from William's body. The men jumped back, eyes wide, before the figment sprang like a flash out of the door and away. Needless to say, the young men hurried out of the cabin and back down the mountain to town, leaving William's body behind. Since that time, the shadowy figure of the old man, the old Coot, is said to be seen along the Thunderbolt Trail, especially during the month of January, or on very snowy nights. It's a great story, really, quite dramatic, and that's why it's been used before, a number of times. It seems that the presumed dead sailor-soldier returning home to a remarried spouse who supposes them dead is an often used lover's story trope, and began long before the story of the old Coot on Mount Greylock. The soldier-sailor presumed dead returning home to find his or her wife/husband remarried is a very old story trope. Some versions of this story have the returning character presenting themselves as alive to their befuddled spouse, while many, and just as the old Coot story does, with the presumed dead character hiding their real identity to save their spouse a broken heart. Enoch Arden was written in 1864 by Alfred Lord Tennyson, and is very much the same story, and Enoch Arden is thought to be the opposite story to the myth of Odysseus, where after 20 years he returns from sea to find his wife had remained loyal and waited for him. This story structure showed up in 1910 in the movie A Sailor's Sacrifice. Enoch Arden was made into movies in both 1911 and 1915. Variation of the story in comedy form were in 1940's My Favorite Wife. That same year, Too Many Husbands was released. In 1962, Marilyn Monroe began the filming of her last movie, which follows the dead spouse is actually alive story trope, called Something's Got to Give, but she'd die before its completion. In 1963, another version with a new cast was made, called Move Over, Darling. Both films were remakes of My Favorite Wife. In the real world, this has actually happened too. The Adventurer, an Australian newspaper, reported on the 11th of September 1945 that an American gunner had returned home after being held as a prisoner of war to find that his family had been told he was dead and his wife had remarried. All of this, of course, is not to say there wasn't a William Saunders in the Berkshires. There was. A few, actually. It's not that uncommon a name. In fact, there was one in Williamstown, but he married a woman named Helen. In all actuality, this story probably came about as a publicity stunt. The North Adams Transcript just happened to publish this story before a great ski race in 1939 on the Thunderbolt Trail on Mount Greylock, and it worked. The story helped draw a lot more attention to the trail, the race, and the mountain itself. There's no mention of the old Coot before 1939. The Berkshire William Saunders I've found didn't vanish during the war. Only one of them was old enough to even fight in it, and he lived. But the story's a good one, and that's why this story's structure is used over and over. And there very well could be a ghost on Mount Greylock. Indeed, people have died up there. Hikers and settlers alike. There was even a fort on the mountainside, which sheltered the earliest settlers of the town of New Ashford. The spirit of any one of them could very well haunt a trail, if you believe in that sort of thing. But as for a real person named William Saunders, who came home to find his wife remarried, probably not. but don't let me discourage you from your own investigations. Putting the puzzles of history together is definitely the best part. This has been The Berkshires Gone By. Created, written, directed, and read by myself, Brooke Grenier, and co-produced by Deanna Garner. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook for a new, old picture of Berkshire history almost every day. You can also find our episodes on Facebook, YouTube, and at our website, www.theberkshiresgoneby.com, where you can find more pictures pertaining to each individual episode and every episode we've ever made. We hope you'll join us for our next episode, and thanks for listening.